Now, this is a video here on mastering Germany, and I'm looking at the second biggest region in Germany, and that is the Pfalz. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the location, the climate, weather, the geology, topography, and I'm going to go into a little bit of grape growing and winemaking as well. So let's begin with the location. There's that same map again. You'll see number 2 there. It's sitting at about 40, just below 49° north, just below, with vineyards here at an average elevation of around 210 meters. That's about 690 feet. Now, the Pfalz is essentially a band of vines that runs north to south. It's about 53 miles long, that's about 85 kilometers in length, and averaging about 4.3 miles in width or 7 kilometers. Now, because of that location, it is going to be warmer than most other regions that we find in Germany. So the region actually is surprisingly kind of Mediterranean. So you'll find some almond plantations here, even olives, figs and palm trees are in some areas. And that's because the area here averages nearly 2,000 hours of sunshine per annum, and the rain is pretty low. It's on the sort of low moderate side at 564 millimeters per year. That's just over 22 inches. Now, you will find that the southern Pfalz, as it goes down towards Alsace, is higher than the Nordpfalz, the northern Pfalz area. The southernmost village, which is Schweigen, sees rainfalls actually at about 800 to 900 millimeters. That's 32 to 34 inches, which is nearly twice the levels of the Mittelhaardt as we go north. Harvests are also 10 days later in the southern Südpfalz, or the Südliche Weinstraße, which is that part towards France in the southern section. So we know it's warm here. The average annual temperatures are 11.4 degrees Celsius. That's a lot more than many others. Some of the other German regions are around late 9s or early 10s. So 11.4 degrees Celsius is 52.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this, of course, enables consistency of ripening, and that means that there's actually a much broader depth of grape varieties that can be produced here. And then of those, you can often find fuller examples because of the better ripening that we find. Let's talk a little bit about the topography of this landscape. So the way of the mountains and the rivers. So here is a map of the sort of southwest of Germany. And you'll see that it is clearly identifying here, and I'll scribble this on. You'll see that the Rhine River is running here. So it goes through Mannheim, through the city of Worms, up to Mainz, heads a little bit west before then heading north again past the Taunus Mountains, Koblenz, as it heads up to the northern Rhine in Westphalia this way. Okay, so that's our major river of this whole area. We are looking down here, right, where you'll see Mannheim, south of Mannheim, and south of Kaiserslautern, and next to the mountains here with the Palatine or the Palatinate forest. And it's this kind of area, this green expanse at the bottom of that map. So the Pfalz is located between that low, densely forested Haardt Mountains, where we find the Palatinate forest, and that is just to the west. And then, where I've scribbled that blue line, the Rhine plain, and then beyond that, what's called the Odenwald Mountains to the east. The Haardt to the west is an extension of Alsace's Vosges. It's a long and low mountain range. So you'll see, I'll draw it here in kind of black, but it's coming from over the border here, the Vosges, and it continues up here as the Haardt Mountains. Okay. So you do have some peaks that rise above 500 meters. That's 1,600 feet, but it's not that high, but it is sufficient enough to block those rain-laden clouds as they come from the westerlies. The Palatinate forest, otherwise known as the Pfalzerwald, is Germany's largest solid contiguous forest, and it's a part of a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. The forest accounts for 1/3 of the total land area of Pfalz, and as such, it is one of the most important impacts on the climate and terroir of this landscape. It also is actually rather important not only for grape growing, but for winemaking, because that forest supplies a lot of the German oak which local coopers in Pfalz use, and there's some of these. Variations in topography account for climatic differences. So in the south, with Schweigen going up to Iblersheim, for example, you get warm air sweeping up from Burgundy, whilst the little gaps in the Haardt mountains can allow cool air from nearby Pfalzerwald forest to penetrate the vineyards, giving localized cooler conditions. And we'll talk about that as we go through some of the single vineyard sites in other videos. So the center of all of this is what we call the Mittelhaardt, so the Middle Haardt. And this is that middle part of the Haardt Mountains. It's an unbroken part of the mountains which protects against rain and wind. That makes the Mittelhaardt warmer and drier than the south. The northern Mittelhaardt, sometimes referred to as the Nordpfalz, are then once again exposed to cool, windy conditions. So we've got impacts here across this lineated north to south region. And that's what really gives us another base for diversity of grape varieties in this exciting region. The principal issues here are frost, mildews, and excessive heat and drought in the likes of the summer months. Let's talk a little bit about geology of the area and a bit of an overview to begin with. And I think it's gone on too far. Hopefully, there you go. Sorry. Let's go back. So the Pfalz is on a currently inactive fault zone. And in the Eocene period, 50 million years ago, the Earth's crust was stretched thin. And this caused a gap or a fissure, which would then get larger and form a kind of wedge-shaped trench. This enormous section of the Earth's crust sank into the trench, displacing and uplifting vast chunks of the crust on either side. This formed what we now know as the Oberrheingraben, or the Upper Rhine Rift Valley. Over time, this depression came a kind of a concentration or a trap for erosive deposits carried by rivers and also by wind erosion, for example. So the Rhine Rift Valley today stretches from right in the southern section of Basel, Switzerland, so that's at the southern section of Baden in Germany, through eastern France and of course southwest Germany, and then as far north as Frankfurt. So 300 kilometers long, 190 miles, and this trench, which was 22 miles wide, sunk as deep as 2.2 miles in some places. That's 3.5 kilometers. That trench has then been filled by sediments. Some of the around this trench are mountains such as the Odenwald and the Haardt, which have been uplifted by 1.5 miles. That's 2.5 kilometers. And the faulting that has occurred here has created quite a mixture of geology. From different eras, we have things like primary rocks, and we'll have eruptive volcanic rocks. And one of the most famous here is around Pechstein, and you'll actually see an area called Pechstein Kopf, which is near Forst in this picture. This is where you have a collapse of a volcanic bit of activity, and it's now filled with water, as you can see. So what about the major soil types, though, for us to look at here? So first of all, loess at nearly 2/3 of the landscape. Now, this doesn't get as much airtime as you would do with limestone or buntsandstein or Kuiper, for example, but loess was widely dispersed throughout Pfalz during the last ice age. So it's often what we find as moreover mixed in with the topsoil in most areas, but also as subsoils, as you'll see here in the picture. Then at 10%, we have Kuiper soils, which are marls formed around 25 million years ago from fine mud and silt sediments. And sometimes these soils are called mudstone. Sand and gravel layers were deposited here as alluvial sediments by the Rhine and its tributaries around 5 million years ago. And these are majorly dominating in the flatter lower areas. Then we have calc, which is minor but gets a lot of airtime, as it does in many wine regions. Only 3% of the Pfalz, and it's formed as reefs in the tertiary era inland sea. It's depositing sedimentary soils from lots of marine life. There are even older Triassic era limestone deposits, which are called shell limestone or muschel calc, from 240 million years ago. And this soil features along the edge of the Haardt Mountains in places like Zellertau's Schwarze Herrgott, but also Iblesheim's Kalmit, which you'll see a cross-section here from the Kranz winery, a visit that I did. Then another that gets, it's 2%, but gets a fair bit of airtime is buntsandstein, which is translated into English as coloured sandstone. This was laid down in the Pfalz when rivers deposited their sediments in an otherwise dry desert landscape around 250 million years ago. It's found on the edge of the Haardt Mountains, particularly in that famed area of the Middle Haardt. It's fairly coarse. It retains water poorly, just like you would find with the Rotliagendes soils that are found in areas like eastern Rheinhessen in Nierstein. It's low in fertility and nutrients, but they do warm up nicely and retain the heat. So heat conductivity here is quite essential. You will find a red equivalent of this coloured sandstone, so rote sandstein, and then also yellow, gelbe. The red variant certainly takes its colour from iron oxide. Where water has leached the iron, yellow sandstone results. So that's where you're finding a lot of leaching of those iron oxides. Now this is famed. The yellow and red variants of sandstein here are quite unique to the Pfalz wine region. Now, as I go through the key villages, I'll talk about how those soils impact the styles later on. Now, the Pfalz actually is mostly flat. If you think back to that original topographical map that I showed you, you have the run of the Haardt Mountains and then kind of a nice flat green colour. So there aren't many steep sites here. There are a few vineyards exceeding 10% slope, with really the maximum ones being sort of 20s and 30s. Most of those are found along the edge of the Haardt Mountains. Viticulture, though, in Pfalz is certainly aided by the mild climate. It doesn't necessarily need those very sharp gradient aspect slopes that you'd find in places like Franken, in places like the Mosel, Rheingau, etc. Disease pressures here are easily managed because of those warm conditions, and vines typically here are managed easier by machines. The problems, as I mentioned earlier, is drought and water stress during the summer months. Many are adopting here biodynamic or organic practices, such as utilizing cover crops to really maximize soil structure and soil health, and rethinking canopy management in terms of helping them through the throes of climate change. Now for something quite fascinating, and this is our chamber training, Kammertbau or Kammertzüchung that you'll see on your slide. This is a form of vine training which stems from the 18th and 19th century. It's similar to pergola, big vines that we may find in places like Spanish-speaking and Italian areas. And it's thought to date back to the Romans and not only just used for grape growing, but other crops as well. We'll also find the likes of head training, gobelet, but Guyot in the area as well. As I mentioned, there has been a bit of a movement towards biodynamics, somewhat around 12% here, to biodynamic and organic. This is in line with the national average, but perhaps we would expect greater from a warmer, drier location. But there are 11 cooperatives in place here. It's difficult to organize organic and biodynamic across those, so it might be an issue for the area. Next up, talking about the dry winemaking. The Pfalz's diversity of grape varieties, which is wonderful, and then also its varying terroir through that geology and also topography that we've been talking about, makes it a beautiful hot pot for different grape varieties. White wines certainly dominate, and more than 57% of the wines are dry. So that's a decent number in the ever increasing dry productions in Germany. Now, Pfalz has undergone somewhat of a shift in identity, typically making historically simpler wines that are consistent, but now we're making some lovely, well-balanced and elegant red wines. There's really good winemaking knowledge here, blends and single varietals, but dry wine styles are dominant. But also there are some lovely sweet wines, some Beerenauslese and Trocken Beerenauslese from the likes of Gelbe Muscatella, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Rieslane, and of course Scheuerrebe. Now you'll find steel and cask fermentations. Neutral casks are much more common than new wood, and there is much more elegance in the production from many of the producers. Now, if we start talking about the use of barrels, like we have talked about the expanse of the Pfalzerwald, the Palatinate forest for oak, where we can then use that oak for German coopers, for German wood production, then we need to talk really also about the instigation of oak across the range by one pioneer specifically, and that was von Winning. Certainly a leading estate with that history being tied to Andreas Jordan and the Bassermann Jordan, but a separate identity. These guys made the unusual move to increase the percentage of new oak casks for the aging of its Rieslings. And this was, of course, something which people went scorned and they didn't take on. But the estate continues to practice this. And they make brilliant wines. Yes, they might be a little bit more powerful, but there's a lot of elegance in these wines. I think if you are going to do this, you need to understand that the wines need brightness and focus and elegance in order to do this. So that ready supply of oak, new oak, is something that they're focused on. So good tradition behind that. And sect production as well. It's been an important factor of Pfalz wine since 1837. And that is the year that Johannes Fitz, which is a fitting name, isn't it? It's a Fitzing name, but it's a fizzing name, founded Germany's second oldest sparkling wine cellar in Bad Dürkheim. And also, I haven't got a picture of it here, but I have thoroughly enjoyed Rijksrat von Bull. So von Bull in Deidesheim, which is another part of that group of the Bassermann Jordan. You have Bassermann Jordan, von Winning, and von Bull. They hired Matthew Kaufmann, the ex-cellar master of Bollinger in Champagne, to build the sect program. And their Winzer sect is fantastic. I've had the real honor of tasting the long 6-year lees aged expression, which was wonderful. Other producers include Christmann and Kaufmann, Frank John, utilizing champagne varietals, but also Riesling and Weissburgunder. And then the VDP Association, the Verband Deutsche Prädikatsweingüter für Pfalz, has actually a significant amount of members, 27, but only harvesting around 931 hectares, which accounts for just under 4% of the total production. The grape varieties permitted are Riesling, Weissburgunder, and also Spätburgunder. That brings me to the conclusion for part 3. I do hope you've enjoyed this free video. If you would like to access the other exclusive videos in this series and many others, which are a part of the Wine with Jimmy Club, you'll need to click on the link in the description of this video and sign up to the monthly subscription for less than a cup of coffee a month at $3.99, and you can cancel at any time. Please do go across and be a part of the Wine with Jimmy Club community. But thank you and Dankeschön until next time. Ciao.